When you think of serial killers, certain names immediately come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These monsters have been dissected, analyzed, and plastered across documentaries for decades. But what about the killers who've somehow slipped through the cracks of public consciousness? The ones whose crimes were just as horrific, just as calculated, yet remain buried in police files and forgotten news archives? Tonight, we're diving into the darkness to uncover 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. Men who lived double lives, who walked among us undetected, who turned murder into an art form while their communities slept peacefully, completely unaware of the monsters in their midst. Our first killer represents something truly terrifying: the family man facade hiding unimaginable evil. Herbert Bowmeister seemed to have it all. A successful businessman running a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot, a beautiful wife named Julie, 3 children, and a sprawling 18-acre estate in Westfield, Indiana, dubbed Fox Hollow Farm, worth over $1 million. To his neighbors, Herb was living the American dream, but beneath that perfect suburban exterior lurked something far more sinister. While his family vacationed during the summers, Baumeister was prowling Indianapolis gay bars, hunting for victims. He would charm young men with his polite demeanor and considerable wealth, luring them back to his estate with promises of drugs, alcohol, and a good time. What they found instead was death. The scope of Baumeister's crimes is staggering when you consider the physical evidence. In 1996, Hamilton County Sheriff's deputies made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Scattered across the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm were thousands upon thousands of decomposed and charred bone fragments, 10,000 individual pieces of human remains, along with handcuffs and shotgun shells. Investigators believe that at least 25 people were buried on that property, though the true number may never be known. The way this nightmare began to unfold reads like something from a horror film. In 1994, Baumeister's own son was playing in the family's wooded backyard when he stumbled upon something no child should ever see: a complete, partially buried human skeleton. When confronted, Baumeister didn't panic. He didn't break down. Instead, he calmly explained to his family that it had been one of his father's old medical skeletons from when he was studying to be a doctor. He claimed he'd stored it in their garage and decided to bury it in the garden. His family believed him. Why wouldn't they? This was their husband, their father, a respected member of the community. The thought that he was systematically murdering people and burying them in their backyard was simply inconceivable. Baumeister's method of operation reveals a predator who understood exactly how to exploit society's blind spots. When his wife and children left for their annual summer vacations, he would drive into Indianapolis and frequent gay bars in areas where men could disappear without much investigation. These were the early to mid-1990s, when missing persons cases involving gay men often received less attention from authorities. Baumeister knew this. He counted on it. Once he lured his victims back to Fox Hollow Farm, he would strangle them to death. But the killing was only the beginning. Investigators believe he burned the bodies, pulverized the bones, and disposed of most of the remains across different parts of his 18-acre property. The methodical nature of this disposal suggests someone who had perfected his technique over many years, someone who took pride in his efficiency. The investigation that would eventually expose Bowmeister began with a missing persons case that refused to go away. When 28-year-old Roger Allen Goodlett vanished after visiting gay bars in Indianapolis, his mother refused to let authorities forget about him. She kept calling, kept pushing, kept demanding answers. Her persistence led investigators to start connecting disappearances that had been treated as isolated incidents. As the investigation gained momentum, a pattern emerged. Multiple young men had vanished after being seen at the same cluster of gay bars. Witnesses began coming forward, describing a well-dressed older man who would buy drinks and engage younger men in conversation. He was polite, seemed wealthy, and always offered to continue the party somewhere more private. The net was closing around Bowmeister, but he had always been one step ahead. When investigators finally obtained enough evidence to search Fox Hollow Farm, they discovered something that would chill them to the bone. Bowmeister had vanished. He had fled the country, abandoning his family and his businesses as the walls closed in around him. On July 3, 1996, Herbert Bowmeister was found dead in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. 357 Magnum revolver. Even in death, his narcissism was on full display. He left behind a 3-page suicide note, but it contained no confessions, no apologies to his victims' families, no acknowledgement of the horror he had inflicted. Instead, he apologized for ruining the scenery of the beautiful Canadian park where he chose to end his life. He expressed regret about his failing marriage and crumbling businesses. The note read like a man sorry for himself, not for the lives he had destroyed. The enduring mystery of Herbert Bowmeister extends far beyond the confirmed victims found at Fox Hollow Farm. Law enforcement has long suspected him of being responsible for a series of murders that terrorized the Midwest throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. The killer, dubbed the I-70 Strangler, murdered at least 11 young men and boys between June 1980 and October 1991, dumping their bodies near Interstate 70. The I-70 victims shared disturbing similarities with Bowmeister's later confirmed kills. All were strangled to death, all were found naked or partially clothed. All had last been seen in or around the same gay bars that Bowmeister would later frequent. And then, mysteriously, the I-70 killings had stopped in 1991, the same year Bowmeister purchased Fox Hollow Farm and began using it as his private burial ground. The investigation into Bowmeister's crimes continues to this day, aided by advances in DNA technology that weren't available in the 1990s. In 2022, Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison launched a renewed effort to identify victims using genetic genealogy. The results have been both heartbreaking and illuminating. In May 2024, they identified Jeffrey Jones, who had disappeared in 1993, as one of Bowmeister's victims. Jones was just 26 years old when he vanished. He had been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend, reduced to fragments scattered across a killer's property. The most disturbing aspect of the Bowmeister case isn't just the number of victims or the methodical nature of his crimes, it's how easily he maintained his double life. His wife, Julie, later claimed she had no idea what her husband was doing during those summer months when she and the children were away. His business associates described him as quirky but successful. His neighbors saw him as a devoted family man who took pride in his beautiful property. But there were signs, clues that might have exposed him earlier if anyone had known what to look for. Bowmeister was obsessed with mannequins, filling his stores and even parts of his home with them. He would dress them, pose them, and according to some reports, even talk to them. Former employees described walking into the stores early in the morning to find mannequins arranged in disturbing tableaux, as if they were engaged in conversations or activities. There were also reports of strange smells emanating from certain areas of Fox Hollow Farm, particularly during the summer months. Neighbors occasionally complained about what they thought was a septic problem or dead animals. The psychological profile that emerges from the Bowmeister case is that of a man who compartmentalized his life so completely that he may have genuinely believed his own lies. During the day, he was Herbert the businessman, Herbert the father, Herbert the community member. But when darkness fell and his family was away, he became something else entirely, a predator who saw other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. Recent developments in the case have raised even more disturbing questions. A new documentary has brought forward witnesses who claim they encountered Bowmeister during his killing years, but managed to escape. One man, Mark Goodyear, initially claimed to be a survivor who escaped from Fox Hollow Farm, but later admitted he had lied to police and was actually a friend of Bowmeister's. His changing story has investigators wondering what else might have been covered up and whether Bowmeister might have had accomplices who have never been identified. The physical evidence suggests the true scope of Baumeister's crimes may never be fully understood. The 10,000 bone fragments found on his property represent an almost incomprehensible level of violence. Forensic experts believe these fragments came from far more than the 11 identified victims, suggesting that Baumeister's killing spree was even more extensive than initially believed. As investigators continue to piece together the full extent of Herbert Baumeister's crimes, one thing becomes clear. He represents a particular type of killer that law enforcement fears most. Not the disorganized, impulsive murderer who leaves obvious clues, but the methodical predator who plans, who learns, who adapts. The killer who understands that the best place to hide is in plain sight, surrounded by the trappings of respectability and success. The Fox Hollow Farm case serves as the chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a business suit, drives a nice car, and lives in a beautiful house. Sometimes it has a family, pays taxes, and contributes to the community. Looking at Joel Rifkin's case, we see how a childhood filled with bullying and social isolation can create the perfect storm for violence. Born in 1959 and adopted at 3 weeks old, Rifken never quite fit in. From kindergarten onward, he was the outcast, the kid who got picked on relentlessly. Learning disabilities made school hell. Other students mocked him, beat him up, treated him like garbage. And all that rage, all that humiliation, it festered inside him like an infection. By high school, Rifken was already having violent sexual fantasies about the girls who rejected him. The bullying had taught him that people were cruel, that the world didn't care about him. So why should he care about anyone else? When his father committed suicide in 1987, that was the final crack in whatever was left of Joel's humanity. The man who had adopted him, given him a home, was gone, and Rifken was left with nothing but his anger and his twisted fantasies, March 1989. That's when the killing started. Rifkin waited for his mother to leave town on business, then picked up a young prostitute named Susie. He brought her back to his Long Island home, the same house where he'd grown up feeling unwanted and alone. He bludgeoned her with a howitzer artillery shell he'd bought at a flea market. When she kept struggling, kept trying to live, he strangled her to death. But that wasn't enough for Rifkin. He needed to erase her completely. He dismembered Susie's body with an X-Acto knife, severed her fingertips so she couldn't be identified, pulled out her teeth with pliers. Her head went into an old paint can. The rest of her went into garbage bags. He scattered the pieces across New York and New Jersey like she was nothing more than trash. And to Rifkin, that's exactly what she was. These women represented everything he hated about the world, everything that had rejected him. The killing didn't stop, it got worse. By 1991, Rifkin had started his own landscaping business, and he used the job sites to stash corpses until he could dispose of them properly. Barbara Jacobs, Mary Ellen DeLuca, Yun Lee. The names pile up like a grotesque inventory. 17 women in total, most of them sex workers and drug addicts. People society had already thrown away. Rifkin saw himself as finishing the job. What's truly chilling about Rifkin is how methodical he was. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. Every murder was carefully planned. He would wait until his mother was out of town, pick up his victims from the same areas, bring them to his home, and follow the same ritualistic pattern: kill, dismember, dispose. He weighted body parts with concrete and dumped them in the East River. He scattered remains across multiple states. He thought he was untouchable, but Rifkin got sloppy. On June 28, 1993, state troopers noticed his pickup truck driving without license plates on the Southern State Parkway. When they tried to pull him over, Rifkin panicked and led them on a 20-minute chase before losing control of his vehicle. In the back of the truck, wrapped in a tarpaulin, was the body of 22-year-old Tiffany Bresciani. She'd been dead for days, decomposing in the summer heat while Rifkin drove around Long Island like nothing was wrong. Bresciani had come to New York from Louisiana to be a dancer. Like so many young women, she'd gotten caught up in drugs and prostitution just to survive. On June 24th, she told her boyfriend she'd be back in 20 minutes after getting into Rifkin's truck. She never came home. Her boyfriend, punk rock musician Dave Rubenstein, was so devastated by her death that he overdosed less than 2 weeks later. One murder became 2 tragedies. During interrogation, Rifkin was almost casual about confessing. He admitted to killing 17 women, describing the murders like he was discussing the weather. There was no remorse, no emotion. He compared it to smoking cigarettes. These weren't human beings to him. They were objects that fed his need for control and violence. The psychological profile that emerged was terrifying in its simplicity. Rifkin had been hurt as a child, so he decided to hurt others as an adult. The bullying, the rejection, the social isolation had created a man who saw other people as enemies to be destroyed. Some experts theorized that he targeted sex workers because he thought his birth mother might have been a prostitute. But the truth is probably simpler and more disturbing. He killed them because he could, because they were vulnerable, because no one would miss them right away. Rifkin was sentenced to 203 years to life in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until 2197, when he'd be 238 years old. He spent 4 years in solitary confinement because prison officials decided he was too notorious for the general population. Today, he sits in Clinton Correctional Facility, giving occasional interviews where he discusses murder like it's an academic subject. The case had such an impact on popular culture that it even showed up in a 1993 episode of Seinfeld, where Elaine dates a man named Joel Rifken and begs him to change his name because of the association with the serial killer. That's how deeply these crimes cut into the public consciousness. A sitcom joke about a name that had become synonymous with evil. But here's what's truly disturbing about Joel Rifken. He wasn't some mysterious figure who emerged from the shadows. He was the quiet kid next door, the one who did landscaping work and lived with his mother. His neighbors described him as polite and hardworking. He held down jobs, paid his taxes, seemed normal on the surface. The monster was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Moving from the calculated brutality of Joel Rifken to our next case brings us to Los Angeles, where another predator was stalking the city's most vulnerable residents. Chester Turner, known as the Southside Slayer, terrorized South Los Angeles for over a decade, leaving a trail of bodies that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history. Chester Dwayne Turner was born in Warren, Arkansas in 1966, but his path to becoming a killer began when he moved to Los Angeles with his mother at age 5. Like so many serial killers, Turner's early life was marked by instability and abandonment. His parents separated when he was young, leaving him without a stable father figure. He attended Locke High School, but dropped out before graduating, already showing signs of the drift that would characterize his adult life. By the time Turner reached adulthood, he was essentially homeless, moving between shelters and missions, working occasional jobs like cooking and delivery for Domino's Pizza. He fathered 4 children with different women, but couldn't maintain stable relationships. After his mother moved to Utah, Turner was left completely adrift in Los Angeles, a city that can swallow the lost and forgotten without a trace. But Turner wasn't just another homeless man struggling to survive. He was a predator who used his knowledge of the streets to hunt. Between 1987 and 1998, he would sexually assault and murder 14 women plus an unborn child, all in a concentrated area around Figueroa Street in South Los Angeles. This wasn't random violence. The capture of Turner came through a seemingly unrelated sexual assault case that demonstrates how DNA evidence revolutionized serial killer investigations. In 2002, Turner was arrested for rape and assault charges involving 2 different women. During processing, his DNA was collected and entered into the national database. Within months, matches began lighting up across multiple cold cases spanning over a decade. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, linking Turner definitively to victim after victim. What made Turner's case particularly significant was the sheer scope of destruction one man could inflict while remaining virtually invisible to law enforcement. For over 10 years, he had operated in a concentrated area of South Los Angeles, targeting the most vulnerable members of society. His victims were primarily African American women, many struggling with drug addiction or working as prostitutes, living on the margins where their disappearances might not be immediately noticed or prioritized by investigators. The method behind Turner's madness reveals a predator who understood his environment intimately. He knew which streets were poorly lit, which areas had minimal police presence, and which women were most isolated from support systems. Turner would approach his victims with offers of drugs or money, luring them to secluded locations where he would sexually assault and then strangle them. The geographic clustering of his crimes suggests he felt comfortable and confident in his hunting ground, developing what investigators call a comfort zone where he could operate with minimal risk of detection. Turner's psychological profile fits the classic pattern of a serial killer who views his victims as objects rather than human beings. During interrogations, he showed no remorse for his actions, displaying the emotional detachment that characterizes psychopathic behavior. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining relationships and fathering children demonstrates the disturbing capacity some individuals possess to live dual lives. The investigation into Turner's crimes revealed the tragic reality of how easily marginalized communities can become hunting grounds for predators. Many of his victims had been reported missing, but their cases received limited resources and attention. The women Turner targeted were often estranged from their families due to addiction or lifestyle choices, making them perfect victims for someone who wanted to kill without immediate consequences. Turner was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. His case remains significant, not just for the number of victims, but for highlighting the vulnerabilities that exist within urban communities and how serial killers exploit social inequalities to find their prey. The Chester Turner case serves as a stark reminder that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows of suburban neighborhoods. Sometimes they hunt in plain sight among society's forgotten. As we examine these cases of Herbert Bowmeister, Joel Rifken, and Chester Turner, a disturbing pattern emerges. These weren't the theatrical killers of Hollywood films or the brilliant masterminds of popular fiction. They were ordinary men who channeled their psychological dysfunction into systematic murder, often targeting the most vulnerable members of society. Baumeister hid behind respectability and wealth, Rifkin behind social awkwardness and invisibility, Turner behind homelessness and urban anonymity. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how long each killer operated before being caught. Baumeister potentially killed for over a decade before taking his own life to avoid capture. Rifkin murdered 17 women over 4 years, only stopped by a routine traffic violation. Turner terrorized South Los Angeles for more than 10 years, his crimes linked only through advances in DNA technology. The common thread connecting these killers is their ability to blend into society while harboring the darkest of impulses. They demonstrate that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare or warning signs visible to all. Instead, it often wears the mask of normalcy, hiding behind facades of suburban respectability, social inadequacy, or urban invisibility. These men prove that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear least threatening, those who society overlooks or dismisses. Their stories serve as sobering reminders that monsters walk among us, often undetected for years, leaving trails of devastation that investigators are still working to fully uncover. The capture of Turner came through a seemingly unrelated sexual assault case that demonstrates how DNA evidence revolutionized serial killer investigations. In 2002, Turner was arrested for the rape of a woman in her apartment. She managed to escape and provided police with a detailed description that led to Turner's identification. When his DNA was processed and entered into the system, it connected him to multiple unsolved murders spanning over a decade. The breakthrough in the Turner case reveals how many serial killers are caught not through brilliant detective work, but through advances in forensic science and the expansion of DNA databases. Turner's DNA matched evidence collected from 14 different crime scenes, finally giving names and closure to victims who had been reduced to case numbers. The body of 21-year-old Diane Johnson, found in 1987, was suddenly connected to murders that occurred years later, revealing the true scope of Turner's killing spree. What makes Turner's case particularly disturbing is how he exploited the most vulnerable members of society. His victims were predominantly African American women involved in prostitution or struggling with drug addiction, living on the margins of Los Angeles society. These were women whose disappearances often went unreported, whose deaths were sometimes dismissed as occupational hazards rather than investigated as the brutal murders they were. Turner understood this dynamic and used it to his advantage, selecting victims he knew the system would overlook. The geographic pattern of Turner's crimes shows a predator who understood his hunting ground intimately. Most of his murders occurred within a concentrated area along Figueroa Street in South Los Angeles, a corridor known for prostitution and drug activity. This wasn't random. Turner was homeless himself, living in shelters and missions in the same neighborhoods where he found his victims. He blended into the landscape of urban poverty, just another face among the forgotten. Turner's method was consistent and brutal. He would approach women on the street, often offering drugs or money for sex. Once isolated, he would strangle them, sometimes sexually assault them, and dump their bodies in alleys, vacant lots, or along freeways. The clinical nature of these murders, the lack of personal connection to his victims, demonstrates the cold calculation of a serial killer who viewed human beings as disposable objects. The timeline of Turner's crimes reveals an escalating pattern of violence throughout the late 1980s and 1990s. His first confirmed victim, Diane Johnson, was murdered in 1987. The killings continued sporadically through the early 1990s, then seemed to intensify in the mid-1990s. By 1998, when his final victim, Brenda Breeze, was discovered, Turner had been killing for over a decade, adapting his methods and becoming increasingly bold in his choice of disposal sites. The investigation that finally brought Turner down was led by detectives who refused to give up on cases that others had written off. The decision to test old evidence for DNA, to connect seemingly unrelated murders across different jurisdictions, required persistence and resources that weren't always available for crimes involving marginalized victims. It's a stark reminder of how social inequalities can extend even into death, determining which murders receive full investigation and which are forgotten. Turner's trial revealed the full scope of his crimes, but also raised questions about how many other victims might remain undiscovered. Prosecutors presented evidence linking him to 14 murders, but investigators suspected the true number could be higher. The transient nature of Turner's lifestyle, his familiarity with the sprawling geography of Los Angeles, and the vulnerable population he targeted meant that other victims might never be connected to him. The sentencing phase of Turner's trial was particularly harrowing, as family members of his victims finally had the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. Many spoke of years of uncertainty, of wondering what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Turner showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the humanity of his victims. He was sentenced to death and currently sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Turner's case has had lasting impact beyond the courtroom. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of women involved in street prostitution, the challenges of investigating crimes in marginalized communities, and the importance of DNA evidence in solving cold cases. The Southside Slayer, as he was known before his identification, had terrorized South Los Angeles for over a decade, but his capture brought some measure of justice to families who had waited years for answers. The Chester Turner case stands as a grim reminder of how predators can operate in plain sight, exploiting societal indifference to vulnerable populations. His victims were human beings with families, dreams, and struggles, not just statistics in a crime database. Their deaths matter not just as evidence of Turner's guilt, but as testament to lives cut short by a man who saw other human beings as nothing more than opportunities to satisfy his urge to kill. What makes cases like Turner's so unsettling is how they reveal the gaps in our social safety net, the places where people can disappear without anyone looking too hard for them. Turner didn't operate in wealthy neighborhoods or target prominent citizens. He hunted in the shadows of American society, among people whose lives were already precarious, whose deaths could be easily dismissed or forgotten. Now, let's explore the fourth killer on our list, Jang Yong Ming, known as the cannibal monster of Yunnan. This case takes us to the rural mountains of China, where a man living in plain sight committed acts so horrific that when the truth finally emerged, it shattered an entire community's sense of safety forever. Jang Yong Ming was born in 1964 in Jining County, Yunnan Province, China. From the outside, he appeared to be just another struggling farmer trying to make ends meet in the mountainous region. He lived alone in a modest house, kept to himself, and seemed harmless enough to his neighbors. But beneath this unremarkable exterior was a predator whose appetite for human flesh would make him one of China's most notorious serial killers. What makes Zhang's case particularly chilling is how he operated for over a decade without raising serious suspicion. Between 1997 and 2012, he systematically lured young men to his remote home, murdered them, and then consumed their flesh. His method was disturbingly simple, yet effective. He would approach young men, often migrant workers or drifters passing through the area, and offer them work or shelter. These were vulnerable people, far from home, with little support network. Perfect victims for a predator who understood how to exploit desperation. Zhang's property became a house of horrors that defied imagination. When police finally searched his home in 2012, they discovered human bones scattered throughout the premises. Some were buried in his garden, others were found in bags hidden around the house. Most disturbing of all, investigators found evidence that Zhang had been systematically butchering his victims and storing their meat for consumption. The forensic evidence painted a picture of methodical cannibalism that had been going on for years. The scope of Zhang's crimes only became clear through painstaking investigation. Authorities eventually linked him to the murders of at least 11 young men, though the true number may be higher. Each victim followed a similar pattern. They were young, usually between the ages of 14 and 20, and they were all people who wouldn't be immediately missed. Zhang specifically targeted individuals who were traveling alone or who had become separated from their families. What's particularly haunting about this case is how Zhang integrated his horrific crimes into his daily life. Neighbors occasionally noticed odd smells coming from his property, but in a rural farming community, strange odors weren't necessarily cause for alarm. He was known to be a bit eccentric, someone who kept to himself and sometimes acted strangely, but nothing that screamed serial killer to the people around him. The breakthrough in the case came in 2012, when a teenage boy managed to escape from Zhang's house. The boy had been lured there under the pretense of work, but when he arrived, something felt wrong. Zhang's behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. The teenager managed to flee and immediately reported the incident to police. When officers arrived at Zhang's property to investigate, they walked into a nightmare. The evidence found at Zhang's home was overwhelming. Human bones, some showing clear signs of being cooked, were discovered throughout the property. Personal belongings from victims were found hidden in various locations. Most damning of all, Zhang's own admissions during interrogation painted a picture of systematic cannibalism that shocked even seasoned investigators. During questioning, Zhang showed little remorse for his actions. He described his crimes in matter-of-fact terms, as if discussing something mundane rather than the systematic murder and consumption of human beings. He claimed that eating human flesh gave him strength and vitality, revealing a deeply disturbed worldview that had guided his actions for over a decade. The investigation revealed that Zhang had developed a sophisticated system for disposing of evidence and maintaining his cover. He would carefully clean and prepare the bodies of his victims, consuming the meat over time while disposing of bones and other remains in various locations around his property. The methodical nature of his crimes suggested someone who had perfected his technique through repeated practice. What makes this case even more disturbing is how Zhang managed to avoid detection for so long. The remote location of his home certainly helped, but it was also a failure of the system to protect vulnerable people. Many of Zhang's victims were migrant workers or homeless individuals whose disappearances weren't immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. This allowed Zhang to continue his killing spree for years without facing serious scrutiny. The trial of Jang Yong Ming was a media sensation in China, with the details of his crimes shocking the nation. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was quickly convicted of multiple counts of murder. The court sentenced him to death, a decision that was carried out in 2013. But even with Zhang's execution, questions remained about how many victims he had actually claimed and whether there were other cases that had gone undetected. The Jang Yong Ming case highlighted serious issues within China's criminal justice system, particularly regarding the investigation of missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations. It also revealed how a serial killer could operate for years in a rural community without detection, preying on society's most vulnerable members. Local residents were left traumatized by the revelation that they had been living next to a cannibal killer for years. Many reported feeling deceived and violated, struggling to reconcile the quiet farmer they thought they knew with the monster he actually was. The case shattered the community's sense of security and trust in ways that took years to heal. Jang's crimes also sparked broader discussions about mental health resources and social safety nets in rural China. Many experts pointed out that better support systems for migrant workers and homeless individuals might have prevented some of these murders. The case became a catalyst for examining how society protects its most vulnerable members. What's particularly chilling about Jang Yong Ming is how ordinary he appeared to everyone around him. He wasn't a reclusive hermit or an obviously disturbed individual. He was just a quiet farmer who kept to himself, someone who blended into the background of rural life. This ordinariness was perhaps his greatest weapon, allowing him to operate undetected while committing some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The forensic investigation of Zhang's property continued for months after his arrest, with investigators working to identify victims and piece together the full scope of his crimes. DNA evidence was crucial in linking remains found on the property to missing persons cases from across the region. The investigation revealed a killing spree that spanned more than a decade and claimed victims from multiple provinces. Jang Yong Ming represents one of the most extreme examples of how serial killers can hide in plain sight. His case demonstrates that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, who blend seamlessly into their communities while harboring the darkest secrets imaginable. The capture of Chester Turner came through a seemingly unrelated sexual assault case that demonstrates how DNA evidence revolutionized serial killer investigations. In March 2002, Turner was arrested for the rape of a woman in downtown Los Angeles. The victim had been walking alone when Turner approached her, forced her into an alley, and sexually assaulted her. She managed to escape and immediately reported the crime to police, providing them with a detailed description of her attacker. DNA evidence collected from the assault was processed and entered into the national database. What happened next stunned investigators. The DNA matched genetic material found at multiple unsolved murder scenes spanning over a decade. Turner wasn't just a rapist, he was one of Los Angeles's most prolific serial killers. The same man who had been living in shelters and walking the streets unnoticed had been systematically hunting and killing women for years. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Turner's crimes. Detectives began connecting murders they had never linked before. The victims had all been found in similar circumstances. Most were sex workers or drug addicts, and all had been strangled to death. Turner's method was consistent but efficient. He would approach vulnerable women on the street, often offering them drugs or money, then lure them to secluded locations where he would rape and strangle them. What made Turner particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into the urban landscape of South Los Angeles. He wasn't a mysterious figure lurking in shadows. He was a homeless man among thousands of other homeless people. He knew the streets, the shelters, the places where desperate people gathered. His victims trusted him because he seemed like one of them, just another person struggling to survive on the margins of society. Turner's trial began in 2007, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA linked him conclusively to 14 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Los Angeles history. The prosecution painted a picture of a predator who had exploited the city's most vulnerable population for over a decade. Turner showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, often staring blankly ahead as prosecutors described his crimes in detail. The families of Turner's victims finally had answers, but those answers came with devastating pain. Many had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Some had assumed their loved ones had simply moved away or were living on the streets somewhere. The reality that they had been murdered by a man who saw them as disposable was crushing. Turner was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The judge called his crimes depraved and callous, noting that Turner had shown a complete disregard for human life. Turner was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row today. He has never expressed remorse for his crimes or provided any insight into his motivations. The Turner case highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized communities to predators who operate within them. His victims were women society often overlooked, struggling with addiction, homelessness, and poverty. Turner understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. He knew that missing persons reports might not be filed immediately, that investigations might not be prioritized, and that he could continue killing without drawing attention. DNA technology was crucial in solving Turner's case, but it also revealed how many serial killers might be operating undetected in urban environments. Turner's crimes spanned over a decade, and he was only caught because of an unrelated assault. Without that single piece of evidence, he might have continued killing indefinitely. The case prompted law enforcement agencies to expand DNA testing programs and prioritize cold cases involving similar victim profiles. Today, Turner's case serves as a reminder of how serial killers can hide in plain sight, particularly in communities where violence and disappearances might not receive immediate attention. He wasn't a mastermind or a criminal genius. He was simply a predator who understood how to exploit society's blind spots. His victims deserved better protection, and their families deserved faster justice. The investigation into Turner's crimes continues even today, as detectives work to determine if he might be responsible for additional unsolved murders. The DNA evidence that finally brought him to justice opened up possibilities that other cold cases might be connected to him. For the families still searching for answers about missing loved ones, Turner's case represents both hope for resolution and the terrible reality of how long predators can operate without detection. Chester Turner's story is a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or elaborate schemes. Sometimes it simply walks among us, quiet and unremarkable, waiting for opportunities to strike. The capture of Chester Turner came through a seemingly unrelated sexual assault case that demonstrates how DNA evidence revolutionized serial killer investigations. In 2002, Turner was arrested for the rape of a 47-year-old woman in downtown Los Angeles. During the booking process, Turner's DNA was collected and entered into the California Department of Justice DNA database. This routine procedure would prove to be the thread that unraveled over a decade of unsolved murders. The breakthrough came when Turner's DNA matched evidence from multiple crime scenes spanning back to the late 1980s. Suddenly, the scattered pieces of what investigators had long suspected was the work of a serial killer began forming a complete picture. the man who had been living invisibly among Los Angeles's homeless population, moving between shelters and missions, was revealed to be one of the city's most prolific killers. What made Turner's case particularly significant was how it exposed the vulnerabilities in society's safety net. His victims were predominantly African American women struggling with drug addiction and poverty, many of whom were involved in prostitution to survive. These were women who existed on the margins of society, whose disappearances often went unreported or were dismissed by authorities as simply part of the transient lifestyle of the streets. Turner's method of operation was both calculated and opportunistic. He would approach vulnerable women, often offering them drugs or money in exchange for sex. Once isolated, he would strangle them with his bare hands, a method that required no weapons and left minimal physical evidence. The bodies were typically dumped in vacant lots, alleyways, or alongside freeways in South Los Angeles, areas where they might not be discovered for days or weeks. The geographic concentration of Turner's crimes reveals a predator who operated within a comfort zone. Most of the murders occurred within a 4-block corridor along Figueroa Street, an area known for drug activity and prostitution. This pattern suggests Turner was familiar with the territory and understood the rhythms of street life, knowing when and where he could strike without drawing attention. The timeline of Turner's murders also coincides with the crack cocaine epidemic that devastated urban communities across America during the 1980s and 1990s. The drug crisis created a population of vulnerable women who were easy targets for predators like Turner. Their addiction made them desperate for money or drugs, while their marginalized status meant fewer people would notice if they disappeared. Turner's case highlights the importance of DNA technology in solving cold cases. Before the advent of DNA testing, connecting murders across different jurisdictions and time periods was extremely difficult. Physical evidence from crime scenes could sit in storage for years without yielding any leads. But DNA changed everything, allowing investigators to link crimes that might never have been connected otherwise. The investigation into Turner's crimes revealed the staggering scope of his violence. Between 1987 and 1998, he had systematically preyed on women in South Los Angeles, killing at least 14 people, including an unborn child. The murders had gone unsolved for years, with some cases growing cold as leads dried up and witnesses disappeared. One of the most tragic aspects of Turner's case was how long he was able to operate undetected. His victims were often women whose lives had been destabilized by poverty, addiction, and trauma. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters who had fallen through society's cracks. Their murders were treated as isolated incidents rather than part of a larger pattern, allowing Turner to continue killing for over a decade. The psychological profile that emerged of Turner painted a picture of a man who exploited society's blind spots. He understood that his victims were unlikely to be missed quickly, if at all. He chose women who were already vulnerable, whose disappearances might be attributed to the dangers of street life rather than predatory violence. This calculated approach allowed him to avoid detection for years. Turner's arrest and conviction brought some measure of justice to the families of his victims, many of whom had been fighting for years to get their loved ones' cases investigated properly. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, linking Turner directly to multiple crime scenes and providing the proof prosecutors needed to secure convictions. In 2007, Turner was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was also convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering the unborn child of one of his victims, making him one of the few people in California to be convicted of fetal murder. The convictions brought closure to families who had waited years for answers about their loved ones' deaths. The Chester Turner case represents more than just the story of one serial killer. It's a window into the social conditions that allowed such crimes to flourish. The crack epidemic, urban decay, and the marginalization of vulnerable populations created an environment where a predator could operate with relative impunity. Turner's victims were casualties not just of his violence, but of a society that had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. Today, Turner remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to appeal his convictions. His case has become a study in how serial killers exploit societal vulnerabilities and how advances in forensic science can finally bring justice to forgotten victims. The women Turner killed may have lived on the margins of society, but their stories serve as a reminder that every life has value and every victim deserves justice. The investigation into Turner's crimes also led to changes in how law enforcement approaches cases involving vulnerable populations. There's now greater recognition that patterns of violence against marginalized communities need to be taken seriously from the start, rather than dismissed as isolated incidents. Now let's dive into the capture of Chester Turner, which demonstrates how advances in forensic science can finally bring justice to victims whose deaths went unsolved for decades. Turner's downfall began in a way that had nothing to do with his string of murders. In 2002, he was arrested for a completely separate sexual assault case. What Turner didn't know was that his DNA sample would be entered into the California DNA database, a system that had been expanding rapidly throughout the late 1990s. This single DNA sample would become the key to unlocking one of Los Angeles's most prolific serial killing sprees. The breakthrough came when cold case detectives began using new DNA technology to re-examine evidence from unsolved murders dating back to the 1980s. The Los Angeles Police Department had been systematically testing DNA evidence from old cases, hoping to find matches in their growing database. When Turner's DNA was compared against evidence from the Southside Slayer murders, the matches were undeniable. His genetic fingerprint was found on multiple victims, creating an ironclad connection between him and a series of brutal killings that had terrorized South Los Angeles for over a decade. This evidence against Turner was overwhelming. DNA samples linked him to the murders of 14 women and an unborn child. The victims ranged in age from their early 20s to their 40s, and most were involved in prostitution or struggled with drug addiction. Turner had specifically targeted women who lived on the margins of society, women whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive search efforts. His hunting ground was a concentrated area of South Los Angeles where poverty, addiction, and desperation created the perfect environment for a predator to operate undetected. What made Turner's crimes particularly heinous was their consistency. Each victim had been sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. The murders showed a methodical approach that suggested Turner had refined his technique over time. He would pick up women, often prostitutes, take them to secluded locations, assault them, and then kill them. The bodies were typically dumped in alleys, vacant lots, or along roadsides, left for others to discover. The investigation revealed that Turner's first confirmed murder occurred in 1987, when he was just 21 years old. Over the following 11 years, he would claim at least 13 more lives. The frequency of his attacks varied, sometimes with months between murders, other times with victims discovered within weeks of each other. This irregular pattern made it difficult for investigators to initially recognize the connection between the crimes. Turner's personal life during this period was chaotic and unstable. He moved between homeless shelters, lived in abandoned buildings, and had a series of temporary relationships. His transient lifestyle made him nearly invisible to law enforcement, even as he was committing some of the most brutal murders in Los Angeles history. He worked sporadically, mostly in low-wage jobs that paid cash, allowing him to avoid creating a paper trail that might have led to his earlier capture. The psychological profile that emerged of Turner painted a picture of a man who felt powerless in most aspects of his life, but found control through violence. His victims were chosen not randomly, but because they represented the most vulnerable members of society. Women involved in prostitution, those struggling with addiction, those who were homeless or had limited family support, these were the people Turner knew he could harm without immediate consequences. When Turner was finally arrested and charged with the murders, the evidence against him was staggering. Beyond the DNA matches, investigators found other connections. Some victims had been seen with Turner before their deaths. His work and living locations corresponded with the geographic pattern of the murders. Cell phone records and other evidence placed him in the vicinity of several crime scenes around the times the murders occurred. The trial revealed the full scope of Turner's crimes. Prosecutors presented evidence linking him to 14 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Los Angeles history. The victims' families, many of whom had waited decades for answers, finally saw justice. But the legal proceedings also highlighted the tragic reality that these women's deaths had initially received little attention from law enforcement or the media, partly because of who they were and where they lived. Turner was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He currently sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he has remained largely silent about his crimes. Unlike some serial killers who seek attention or try to explain their actions, Turner has shown little interest in discussing his murders or providing closure to the families of his victims. The Turner case represents a significant victory for forensic science and cold case investigation techniques. It demonstrated how DNA technology could solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable, bringing justice to victims whose deaths had gone unanswered for years. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining DNA databases and continuing to test evidence from unsolved crimes as technology advances. But perhaps most importantly, Turner's case exposed the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. His victims were women who lived dangerous lives, often without strong support systems or people who would immediately notice their absence. Their deaths revealed the harsh reality that in a city of millions, it's possible for a serial killer to operate for over a decade by targeting those whom society tends to overlook. The Southside Slayer case serves as a reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Thanks to advances in forensic science and the dedication of cold case detectives, Chester Turner was finally held accountable for his crimes. But it also stands as a testament to the 14 women whose lives were cut short by his violence, women who deserved better protection from the society that failed them in life, but finally remembered them in death. Turner's story demonstrates how serial killers often exploit the cracks in our social safety net, targeting those who are least likely to be missed and most likely to be forgotten. His crimes went undetected for so long, not because he was particularly clever, but because he understood which victims society was least likely to search for. Our final case brings us to a predator who operated in the shadows of New York's most infamous decade of crime. While the city was gripped by fear over the son of Sam killings and other high-profile cases, another monster was methodically hunting victims in the shadows, leaving a trail of brutality that would take decades to fully uncover. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, but grew up in Rivervale, New Jersey. On the surface, he appeared to be the embodiment of suburban success. Married with 3 children, he worked as a computer operator for Blue Cross Blue Shield in Manhattan, commuting daily from his comfortable home in New Jersey. His neighbors saw him as quiet, well-dressed, and unremarkable. But behind this facade of normalcy lurked something far more sinister. Cottingham's crimes began in the late 1960s, but it wasn't until the 1970s that his violence escalated to murder. His hunting ground was primarily New York City, particularly Times Square, and the surrounding areas that were then known for prostitution and adult entertainment. This wasn't coincidental. Like so many serial killers, Cottingham deliberately targeted society's most vulnerable members, women he believed wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't generate significant police attention. What set Cottingham apart from other serial killers was his extreme brutality and his apparent enjoyment of torture. He didn't simply kill his victims. He subjected them to prolonged suffering, often keeping them alive for hours while he inflicted unimaginable pain. His methods were so savage that even seasoned homicide detectives were horrified by the crime scenes he left behind. The case that would ultimately lead to Cottingham's capture began on December 2nd, 1979, at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel in Times Square. Firefighters responding to a blaze in room 417 discovered a scene that defied comprehension. 2 bodies lay on the beds, both decapitated and missing their hands. The killer had attempted to burn the evidence, but the fire had been contained before destroying everything. The victims were later identified as Dide Gudarzi, a 22-year-old sex worker from Iran, and an unidentified woman whose name remains unknown to this day. The meticulous removal of heads and hands wasn't random violence. It was calculated. Cottingham knew that without these identifying features, the bodies would be much harder to identify, buying him time and potentially allowing him to escape justice entirely. The fact that he attempted to burn the evidence showed a level of premeditation and criminal sophistication that chilled investigators. But this wasn't Cottingham's first murder, nor would it be his last. Just 3 months earlier, on May the 5th, 1980, the body of 19-year-old Valerie Ann Street was found at the same motel. She had been tortured, sexually assaulted, and killed in a manner consistent with Cottingham's signature brutality. The killer was becoming bolder, returning to the same location where he felt comfortable operating. Cottingham's ability to evade capture for so long stemmed partly from his understanding of police procedures and investigative limitations. Working in Manhattan during the day gave him intimate knowledge of the city's rhythms and blind spots. He knew when and where to hunt, how to avoid detection, and how to dispose of evidence. His suburban home life provided the perfect cover, allowing him to return to his family after committing horrific crimes, playing the role of devoted husband and father. The breakthrough in the case came through what initially appeared to be an unrelated incident. On May 22, 1980, Cottingham abducted 18-year-old Leslie Ann Odell and 19-year-old Diane Cusick from a shopping mall in New Jersey. He took them to a motel room where he tortured and sexually assaulted both women. However, unlike his previous victims, these women survived. Odell managed to escape and alert authorities, providing them with their first solid description of the killer. When police arrested Cottingham at his workplace the following day, they initially thought they had caught a simple kidnapper and rapist. They had no idea they were looking at one of New York's most prolific serial killers. It was only as the investigation deepened that the true scope of his crimes began to emerge. Under interrogation, Cottingham initially denied everything, but as evidence mounted against him, he began to reveal details about his crimes that only the killer could know. He described his methods with chilling detachment, explaining how he selected victims, how he tortured them, and how he disposed of evidence. There was no remorse in his voice, no recognition of the humanity of his victims. They were simply objects to him, things to be used and discarded. The investigation revealed that Cottingham's crimes spanned more than a decade and multiple states. He was ultimately linked to at least 11 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be much higher. His victims ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 30s, but they shared common characteristics. Most were sex workers or women involved in the adult entertainment industry, people whose disappearances might not generate immediate police attention. One of the most disturbing aspects of Cottingham's case was his ability to compartmentalize his crimes from his family life. His wife and children had no idea what he was doing during his trips to the city. He would return home from committing torture and murder, help his children with homework, and maintain the facade of a loving family man. This psychological compartmentalization is a hallmark of organized serial killers, but few demonstrate it as effectively as Cottingham did. During his trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who derived sexual pleasure from causing extreme pain and suffering. Expert witnesses testified about his psychological profile, describing him as a sadistic psychopath who viewed his victims as less than human. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including physical evidence, and witness testimony, and his own confessions. Cottingham was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also convicted of numerous other charges, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. Even behind bars, he continued to manipulate and control, providing information about additional crimes in exchange for small privileges or attention from investigators. What makes Cottingham's case particularly significant is how it illustrates the challenges law enforcement faced during the 1970s and early 1980s. This was before DNA evidence, before computerized databases that could link crimes across jurisdictions, before many of the forensic tools we take for granted today. Cottingham exploited these limitations, operating across state lines and targeting victims whose cases might not receive full investigative attention. The case also highlights the societal attitudes towards sex workers and marginalized women that allowed predators like Cottingham to operate with relative impunity. Police departments often didn't prioritize cases involving prostitutes, assuming they were simply transient or had moved to another area. This institutional bias created hunting grounds for serial killers who understood they could target certain populations with less risk of being caught. Even decades after his conviction, Cottingham continued to confess to additional murders. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have allowed investigators to link him to cold cases dating back to the 1960s. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to the 1968 murder of Diane Cusick, a case that had remained unsolved for over 50 years. He has also been linked to several other murders in New York and New Jersey, with investigations ongoing. Today, Richard Cottingham sits in Southwood State Prison in New Jersey, serving multiple life sentences. He will never be released. But his case serves as a stark reminder of how serial killers can hide in plain sight, using the veneer of respectability to mask the most heinous crimes imaginable. He worked alongside hundreds of people who never suspected that their quiet, well-dressed colleague was one of the most brutal killers in American history. The Cottingham case, like the others we've explored today, demonstrates a disturbing truth about human nature. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs or dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it wears a business suit, lives in the suburbs, and says good morning to the neighbors. It reminds us that predators walk among us, often indistinguishable from ordinary citizens, until their carefully constructed masks finally slip. These 5 killers, Herbert Bowmeister, Joel Rifken, Chester Turner, Jang Yong Ming, and Richard Cottingham, represent different facets of human evil, but they share common characteristics. They all targeted vulnerable populations. They all maintained facades of normalcy while committing horrific crimes. And they all demonstrate how serial killers can operate for years or even decades before being caught, leaving trails of devastation in their wake. Their stories serve as sobering reminders that evil is not always easily recognizable, that predators often hide behind masks of respectability, and that society's most vulnerable members remain at risk from those who see them as nothing more than disposable objects. Understanding these cases isn't about glorifying violence or feeding morbid curiosity. The psychological profile of these killers reveals disturbing patterns that should concern every one of us. These men didn't operate in isolation. They moved through communities, worked jobs, interacted with neighbors, and in many cases, maintained relationships while simultaneously destroying lives. The fact that they could compartmentalize their horrific crimes so effectively speaks to a level of psychological detachment that's genuinely terrifying. What's particularly chilling about Turner's case is how his capture finally came through an unrelated sexual assault. In 2002, Turner was arrested for the sexual assault of a woman who survived his attack. DNA evidence from this assault was entered into the system, and it matched evidence found at multiple murder scenes dating back to the late 1980s. This connection wasn't made through brilliant detective work or a slip-up on Turner's part. It was pure chance, the result of technological advancement and database expansion that finally linked him to his crimes. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. Turner's genetic profile matched biological evidence found on at least 14 victims. The murders had been methodical, brutal, and concentrated in a specific geographic area of South Los Angeles. Most of his victims were vulnerable women, many involved in prostitution or struggling with drug addiction. They were women that society often overlooked, which allowed Turner to operate undetected for over a decade. Turner's method was consistent and calculated. He would strangle his victims, often after sexually assaulting them. The bodies were typically found in areas where Turner was familiar with the terrain, suggesting he chose locations where he felt comfortable and confident he wouldn't be discovered. The concentration of murders in a 4-block corridor along Figueroa Street indicates a predator who had established a hunting ground and knew it intimately. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once Turner was identified. In 2007, he was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that there was little doubt about his guilt. The DNA matches, combined with the pattern of murders and the geographic concentration, created an airtight case that prosecutors had no difficulty proving. Turner's case highlights several disturbing aspects of serial murder in urban environments. First, the vulnerability of his victim population meant that many disappearances weren't immediately investigated as thoroughly as they might have been if the victims had been from more affluent backgrounds. Second, the lack of advanced forensic technology in the 1980s and 1990s meant that crucial evidence sat unanalyzed for years. Third, Turner's ability to blend into his environment as just another homeless man allowed him to avoid suspicion, even as bodies piled up in his preferred hunting ground. The fourth case that demands our attention involves Jang Yong Ming, known as the cannibal monster of Yunnan province. Zhang's crimes are so disturbing that they challenge our understanding of human depravity. Operating in rural China from the 1990s through the 2000s, Zhang appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary farmer living a simple life in the countryside. The reality was infinitely more horrifying. Jang Yong Ming was born in 1957 in Yunnan province, a mountainous region in southwestern China known for its rural communities and traditional way of life. By all external appearances, Zhang lived the life of a typical farmer. He grew crops, tended to his land, and maintained a modest existence that drew no attention from authorities or neighbors. This facade of normalcy was his greatest weapon, allowing him to operate as a predator for over a decade without raising suspicion. Zhang's victims were primarily young men, often migrant workers or drifters who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. He would approach these men with offers of work or shelter, presenting himself as a helpful local farmer who understood the struggles of rural life. His targets were chosen carefully, individuals who were isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to have people actively searching for them if they vanished. The methodology Zhang employed was both brutal and methodical. He would lure victims to his remote farm with promises of employment or temporary housing. Once isolated on his property, Jang would kill his victims, typically through blunt force trauma or strangulation. But the murders were only the beginning of his horrific crimes. Jang would then dismember the bodies, consuming portions of the human flesh and disposing of the remains in ways designed to prevent identification. The cannibalistic aspect of Jang's crimes sets him apart from most serial killers. This wasn't opportunistic behavior or the result of a psychotic break. Jang's consumption of human flesh appeared to be a deliberate and ritualistic component of his crimes. He would prepare and cook the human meat, sometimes mixing it with animal flesh. The methodical nature of this behavior suggests a level of premeditation and psychological detachment that defies comprehension. Jang's ability to maintain his facade while committing these atrocities is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his case. Neighbors described him as quiet but unremarkable, a man who kept to himself but caused no trouble. He participated in local community activities when necessary and maintained the appearance of a struggling but honest farmer. This ability to compartmentalize his crimes while living a seemingly normal life demonstrates a level of psychological control that makes him particularly dangerous. The discovery of Jang's crimes came about through sheer chance, much like many serial killer cases. In 2008, a teenage boy managed to escape from Jang's farm after being held captive. The boy had been lured to the property with promises of work, but quickly realized he was in mortal danger. His escape and subsequent report to authorities led to an investigation that uncovered the full scope of Jang's crimes. When police searched Jang's property, they found evidence of multiple murders spanning more than a decade. Human remains were discovered buried around the farm, along with personal belongings from numerous victims. The physical evidence painted a picture of systematic murder and disposal that had been ongoing for years. Jang had created an efficient system for luring, killing, and disposing of victims that allowed him to operate undetected in plain sight. The investigation revealed that Jang had likely killed dozens of victims, though the exact number may never be known. Many of his victims were migrant workers whose disappearances weren't immediately reported or investigated. The rural location of his crimes and the transient nature of his victim population created perfect conditions for a serial killer to operate without detection. Jang's trial and execution followed swiftly once his crimes were discovered. Chinese authorities showed no tolerance for the severity and nature of his crimes. He was convicted of multiple murders and cannibalism, receiving the death penalty. His execution in 2012 ended one of the most disturbing serial killing sprees in modern Chinese history. The final case we must examine is that of Richard Cottingham, known as the Torso Killer or the Times Square Ripper. Cottingham's crimes spanned from the late 1960s through the early 1980s, a period when forensic technology was limited and many of his crimes went unconnected for decades. His case demonstrates how serial killers can hide in plain sight, maintaining normal family lives while committing horrific acts of violence. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, New York. He grew up in a middle-class family and appeared to have a normal childhood and adolescence. As an adult, he worked as a computer operator for Blue Cross Blue Shield in New York City, a respectable white-collar job that provided him with a stable income and social standing. He married, had children, and lived in suburban New Jersey, presenting the image of a successful family man. Cottingham's double life began to emerge in the late 1960s when he started frequenting the seedy areas of Manhattan, particularly Times Square and the surrounding neighborhoods. This area was known for its adult theaters, massage parlors, and street prostitution. It was here that Cottingham found his victims, vulnerable women working in the sex trade who could disappear without immediate investigation. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1967, though investigators suspect he may have been killing earlier. The victim was Nancy Shiava Vogel, a 29-year-old woman whose body was found in her car in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered, but at the time there was no way to connect this crime to the mild-mannered computer operator living nearby. Cottingham's methodology evolved over time, becoming increasingly brutal and elaborate. He would pick up victims in Manhattan, often prostitutes or women involved in the adult entertainment industry. He would then take them to hotels, typically in New Jersey or New York, where he would torture, sexually assault, and murder them. His crimes were characterized by extreme violence and mutilation, earning him his gruesome nicknames. One of Cottingham's most infamous crimes occurred in December 1979 at a motel in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. He had taken 2 women to the motel, where he tortured and killed them before setting the room on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. When firefighters discovered the bodies, they found that both victims had been decapitated and their hands had been severed, making identification extremely difficult. This deliberate removal of identifying features became a signature of Cottingham's crimes. The fire was intended to destroy all evidence, but it wasn't entirely successful. Some physical evidence survived, though forensic technology of the time couldn't extract the kind of information that would be possible today. The case remained unsolved for decades, one of many brutal murders that authorities suspected were connected but couldn't definitively link. Cottingham's capture came in May 1980, not through brilliant detective work, but through a routine police response. Officers were called to a motel in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, regarding a disturbance. When they arrived, they found Cottingham in a room with an 18-year-old woman who had been tortured and was near death. The woman survived and was able to provide testimony about her ordeal. The scene police discovered was horrific. The room contained evidence of prolonged torture and sexual assault. Cottingham had brought a kit of implements specifically designed to inflict pain and suffering. The methodical nature of his tools and techniques revealed this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned and executed torture session. Cottingham was immediately arrested and charged with attempted murder, sexual assault, and other crimes related to the May 1980 incident. However, it would take years for investigators to connect him to his other murders. The technology and investigative techniques of the early 1980s simply weren't sufficient to link crimes that had been committed years apart in different jurisdictions. The breakthrough in connecting Cottingham to his earlier murders came decades later through advances in DNA technology and the dedication of cold case investigators. In the 2000s and 2010s, DNA evidence from crime scenes was reanalyzed using modern techniques. These tests revealed matches between evidence from multiple crime scenes, finally providing the scientific proof that these murders were connected and committed by the same person. One by one, cold cases were reopened and linked to Cottingham through DNA evidence. The 1967 murder of Nancy Schiavovogel was connected to him in 2010. Additional murders from the 1970s were linked through DNA and other forensic evidence. Each connection revealed more about the scope and brutality of Cottingham's crimes. In recent years, Cottingham has confessed to additional murders, some dating back to the 1960s. These confessions have helped provide closure to families who had waited decades for answers about their loved ones. However, investigators believe he may have been responsible for many more murders that remain unsolved. Cottingham's case illustrates several disturbing realities about serial killers and the criminal justice system. First, his ability to maintain a normal family and professional life while committing horrific crimes demonstrates the frightening capacity some individuals have for compartmentalization. His wife and children had no idea about his double life, a fact that's both tragic and terrifying. Second, his case highlights how the limitations of forensic technology in earlier decades allowed serial killers to operate with relative impunity. Without DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, and modern investigative techniques, connecting crimes across jurisdictions and time periods was extremely difficult. Many of Cottingham's victims and their families waited decades for justice simply because the technology to solve their cases didn't exist when the crimes were committed. Third, Cottingham's victim selection reveals the societal factors that can enable serial killers. By targeting women involved in prostitution and the adult entertainment industry, he chose victims who were marginalized and whose disappearances might not be immediately investigated with the same vigor as those from more privileged backgrounds. This unfortunate reality allowed him to kill repeatedly without drawing the attention of law enforcement. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Cottingham's crimes is deeply disturbing. His escalating violence, elaborate torture methods, and attempts to prevent victim identification suggest a high level of planning and a complete lack of empathy for human suffering. The fact that he could commit these acts and then return to his suburban home to have dinner with his family reveals a level of psychological detachment that's genuinely chilling. Today, Cottingham is serving multiple life sentences in New Jersey's state prison. He's now in his 70s and continues to cooperate with investigators, providing information about unsolved cases. His willingness to confess to additional murders in recent years has helped solve cold cases and provide some measure of closure to victims' families, though it can never truly heal the wounds his crimes created. These 5 cases, Herbert Bowmeister, Joel Rifken, Chester Turner, Jang Yong Ming, and Richard Cottingham, represent some of the most disturbing examples of serial murder in modern history. What makes them particularly frightening isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but their ability to hide in plain sight, to maintain facades of normalcy while committing acts of unimaginable cruelty. Each of these men operated for years, sometimes decades, before being caught. They killed dozens, possibly hundreds of victims combined. They targeted the most vulnerable members of society, people who were often overlooked or marginalized. And they were only caught through a combination of luck, technological advancement, and the dedication of investigators who refused to give up on cold cases. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that evil can wear many faces. It can look like a successful businessman, a quiet landscaper, A homeless drifter, a rural farmer, or a suburban computer operator. The monsters we fear aren't always the ones hiding in shadows. Sometimes they're hiding behind smiles, living next door, working in the next cubicle, or serving food at the local restaurant. These cases also highlight the importance of advances in forensic science, particularly DNA technology, in solving crimes and delivering justice. Without these technological advances, many of these killers would never have been caught, and their victims would never have received justice. The dedication of cold case investigators who refuse to let these crimes go unsolved is equally important in ensuring that even decades-old murders still result in convictions. Perhaps most importantly, these cases remind us of the humanity of the victims. Behind every statistic, every crime scene photo, every court document, there was a real person with hopes, dreams, fears, and people who loved them. Many of these victims were society's most vulnerable members, but they deserved protection, dignity, and justice just like anyone else. The fact that you've likely never heard of these killers, despite the scope and brutality of their crimes, speaks to how quickly society moves on from even the most horrific events. But remembering these cases, understanding what happened, and learning from them is crucial if we hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future. These stories are difficult to hear, disturbing to contemplate, and impossible to fully comprehend, but they're also important reminders of the capacity for both evil and good that exists in our world. While these 5 men represent the darkest aspects of human nature, the investigators, forensic scientists, and advocates who worked tirelessly to bring them to justice represent the best of what we can be. In the end, that may be the most important lesson from these cases. Evil exists, and it can be sophisticated, patient, and terrifyingly effective. But good exists too, and given enough time, dedication, and resources, justice can prevail, even decades after the fact. The victims of Herbert Bowmeister, Joel Rifken, Chester Turner, Jang Yong Ming, and Richard Cottingham deserved better from the world that failed to protect them. The least we can do is remember their stories and ensure that their killers are never forgotten, not as cautionary tales, but as reminders of the price of our vigilance and the value of every human life. Casual encounters. He was hunting. Baumeister had developed a twisted ritual that would turn his beautiful estate into one of the largest serial killing sites in American history. His method was as calculated as it was brutal. When his wife and children would leave for summer vacations or weekend trips, Baumeister would venture into Indianapolis, specifically targeting a 4-block radius of race bars. He was looking for a particular type of victim, young men who were vulnerable, often runaways or those living on the margins of society. Men who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. Baumeister's weapon of choice wasn't a gun or a knife. He preferred strangulation, using his bare hands or ligatures to slowly squeeze the life out of his victims. But what made him truly terrifying was what he did after the killing. He had turned murder into a systematic operation, with his pool serving as the perfect lure. Investigators later discovered that he would invite his victims back to Fox Hollow Farm with promises of parties, drugs, or simply a place to swim and relax. Once they were isolated on his property, with no witnesses and no way to escape, Baumeister would strike. He would strangle his victims, then methodically dispose of their bodies around his 18-acre estate. But he didn't just bury them. He burned many of the corpses, pulverized the bones, and scattered the remains across different areas of his property. It was a level of planning and disposal that spoke to someone who had thought long and hard about how to make people disappear without a trace. The scale of what investigators eventually discovered at Fox Hollow Farm was staggering. When police finally obtained a search warrant in 1996, they uncovered what can only be described as a charnel house. More than 10,000 bone fragments were scattered across the property. Investigators found the remains of at least 25 people, though they believe the actual number could be much higher. Among the evidence were handcuffs, shotgun shells, and personal items belonging to victims who had vanished years earlier. But Bowmeister's killing spree may have started long before he purchased Fox Hollow Farm. Police believe he was responsible for the I-70 Strangler murders, a series of killings that terrorized Indiana and Ohio from 1980 to 1991. 11 young men and boys were found murdered along Interstate 70, their bodies dumped in rivers, streams, and ditches. All had been strangled, and all bore the hallmarks of Bowmeister's later confirmed murders. What's particularly chilling is the timeline. The I-70 Strangler murders stopped in 1991, the same year Bowmeister purchased Fox Hollow Farm. It's as if he evolved from dumping bodies along highways to creating his own private killing ground. This suggests that his murder spree may have lasted over 15 years, making him potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The investigation that finally brought Bowmeister down began with the determination of families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. In 1994, relatives of missing gay men in Indianapolis hired a private investigator after feeling that police weren't taking their concerns seriously. Multiple young men had vanished after being seen at local gay bars, all fitting a similar profile in age and build. The breakthrough came when a man named Mark Anthony Goodyear came forward with a disturbing story. He told the private investigator about a strange encounter he'd had with a man he met at a bar. The man had invited him back to his home, but something about the situation felt wrong, and Goodyear had managed to escape. Through word of mouth and careful detective work, they managed to get the license plate number of the man's vehicle.